One moment your character is talking on the phone with a friend, and the next the connection is lost. Write a story about what follows.
Well, it didn't turn out the way I'd planned, that's for sure. Paul loosened his tie with a free hand, nodding in response to whatever was being said on the other side of the line. No, I'm amazed, actually. For once, it turned out better than ever. Yeah, I know. That's what I thought, too. Paul crossed the dark street, eyes set on the next illuminated spot beneath the nearest towering streetlight. Steam hissed from a vent on the massive building, watching like a stony, glassy gargoyle as he passed beneath. Its empty eyes followed Paul as he wandered purposefully through the night, with his phone pressed to his ear. A concentrated frown fractured his forehead. Hey, Ronnie, can you say that last part again? You said you had something to tell me? You're cutting out. I don't know if it's on your end or mine, but I'm only catching about every other word. Ronnie? Paul stumbled over his untied shoelace. He stopped on the sidewalk and held his cell phone up in the air, squinting into the bright screen before bringing it back to his ear. Ronnie? He held it up again. The call had been lost. Paul impulsively redialed his oldest friend, eager to know what Ronnie had been trying to tell him. It went straight to voicemail. Paul sighed, pressing his phone between the side of his head and shoulder while he stooped to retie his shoe.
Hey bud, sorry about that. I don't know if that was my phone or yours, but I'm gonna go ahead and assume it's yours, because I have full bars. I guess I never asked where you were. Thanks for helping me through this last week. I don't know if you noticed, I was kind of a wreck until I heard the good news today.
Paul paused for a moment, enjoying the rush of gratitude he felt toward his friend as he breathed in the night air around him.
I think that meeting might have turned out a lot different without your coaching. So, anyway, as always, thanks for showing up. I owe you one, and I'll give you a call at the end of the week if I haven't heard from you. See ya. Oh, it's Paul, by the way.
Paul ended the call. He stretched and hopped his way over a puddle before falling into step behind a gaggle of boisterous pedestrians. The little group appeared to be heading from one place to the next on a tour of the central vein encompassing the downtown arena he was currently passing through. Paul looked both ways, suddenly feeling less social than just moments before. This was his special moment to celebrate however he wanted to, and he didn't want to just share it with anyone. He was excited to get back to home base and soak it all in over a neat whiskey on his own front porch. Paul skipped over a lip on the sidewalk. He was finally moving up in the world. The winds of fortune were shifting. He could see the possibilities unfolding and pouring out in front of him. Paul closed his eyes and felt lifted into the infinite possibilities coming to mind. This might lead here, and that to over there, and then maybe the other will just fall into place naturally. Yes, that's exactly what would happen. He could see it all so clearly. Unlike their phone connection, the conversation had been a clear signal from the universe that things were changing for the better. Not just for Paul, but for others close to him. As far as he could tell, Ronnie seemed to be doing great too. He stuffed the phone into his pocket and fell into step behind the lively party. He smiled, breathing in the energy in his surroundings. Music poured from the face of the building they were passing as some door opened. Bands were clapping and whooping along with the melody currently playing. The sounds of the entertained crowd then grew quiet as the entrance closed. Paul stuffed his hands into his pockets, perfectly satisfied with the moment, and for the first time in a long time, His mind was hungry for peaceful silence. Success and growth were in the air. It was everywhere he looked. Paul breathed in, his internal compass guiding him home, allowing him to experience and express his contentment over feeling more sure than ever that his lucky stars were in full bloom. On the other side of the line, Ronnie's view was very different. After Paul's voice had cut out, Ronnie focused harder, trying to understand the words coming through. His concentrated frown pierced the ground. Ronnie stumbled back. Ouch! Oh, what the heck? He'd only been looking down for a moment, and prior to looking away from dead ahead, the sidewalk had been completely open for at least another 300 yards. There hadn't even been any vehicles outside the grill Ronnie had cozied up to. The street out front had all been empty. He rubbed his forehead. All he'd wanted was some warm grub and ice-cold, bubbly booze. It had been a long week. Ronnie had barely put in his order when his phone screen had lit up, Paul's face painted over the screen. Ronnie groaned. He held his face, running his fingertips along its surface, assessing the damage. He lost balance, tripping over his own feet while trying to balance on them. Ronnie landed hard on his backside and skidded his palms over the rough, uneven surface. Oofed! He gasped, heaving uneven, shallow breaths while he recovered from the double impact. Maybe he shouldn't be drinking if this was his luck while sober. Ron's head swam. His spine and elbows tingled. The abrasive reflex to throw his hands down behind himself might have saved his skull, but he could feel his heart throbbing through his wrists. This was gonna hurt later. He groaned, reaching to rub his head only to flinch at the surge of pain radiating through his thumb and ring fingers on either hand. He shook them out gently in front of himself while gathering his bearings. Once he'd recovered his breath and uncrossed his eyes from the shock of the impacts, Ronnie took in his assailant, following it from its jagged brick foot to its slanted roof 4 stories above. What the heck? He puzzled. How had he missed this looming building, and why didn't it look familiar? He looked behind himself to find an utterly barren street. Just moments before, he'd walked out of a lively bar and grill. He'd been ready to dig into a beer and some wings and just wind down, but life had other plans. He could have let the phone ring and just call Paul back after he'd eaten, but that wasn't how either of them operated in their friendship. Which is why Ronnie had been doing what he should have done to begin with. He'd been in the process of letting his oldest accomplice in on a secret he'd been keeping to himself when the phone had cut out. It was like life didn't want to let him off the hook just yet. Ronnie rubbed his head. I guess that's what I get, he thought. I should have just told the truth to begin with. At the time, it had seemed selfish to Ronnie to lay out his situation while Paul was in the middle of his own. After all, Paul had been the one that had called, looking for a boost. Someone to tell him everything would work out. Ronnie put more pressure on his forehead. He enjoyed helping where he could, but this was getting ridiculous. As always, it hadn't taken Paul's pending breakthrough long to explode into existence. This time hadn't been any different than any of the others. Paul had come to a point where he had to make a decision, and once he did, the pending breakthrough took no time at all to explode into existence. Ronnie rubbed at his temples. So why had his life purpose been dragging its feet so hard? He slouched around himself, feeling his joints to see if anything was out of place. Ronnie was happy for his friend. It hadn't been difficult to offer Paul encouragement because what he was asking life for, it made sense. It seemed reasonable and it fit perfectly with the training and experiences he developed over the span of their lifelong friendship. Being Paul's friend had never been difficult at all. He was the kind of person you'd be crazy not to believe in. The kind of person who got stuff done and saw the walls they were approaching before they ran headlong into them. All Ronnie had had to do was offer Paul the input and encouragement he'd wished someone would have given to him as freely. They were both in different fields of expertise, but their approach to life had always been similar, which is why, maybe, they'd been such good friends. Both had a tendency to run in with both hands and feet fully engaged, or turn the space on its head if necessary. They'd always been each other's greatest competition. This last interaction had been about Paul. It was his turn to lean, and Ronnie's duty as a best friend to play sidekick and keep his struggles to himself until his support was no longer needed and the roles could reverse for a consult of his own. He reflected on it while he felt both of his wrists. Walking face first into a wall wasn't the first thing that had blindsided Ronnie in the recent past. The action was something of an analogy to his life as of late. The collision had felt symbolic and ironic immediately. Ron rubbed his temples for a moment more while cupping a cold hand over his forehead forcefully in the hope it might combat any future swelling. To put it short and sweet, Ronnie felt his patience was running low. The smallest things had had him on edge. He'd been certain, up until running into that wall, that he might lose his marbles completely if anything else played out poorly. Unlike his closest companion, things in Ron's life hadn't panned out as expected. His ideas had always been a little more far-fetched, but he'd never seen them as unattainable until recently. With that thought, Ronnie dropped the full weight of his head into his hands, trying to feel his way through the throbbing in his temples. He'd really rattled his brain's cage this time. It wasn't like he felt that where he was would be the end or anything. Ronnie knew in his heart of hearts it was just a stop along the way. He could almost picture his insides tapping their feet and looking at their wristwatches like, any day now, any day now. He felt the same way. He squeezed his fingers over his eyes, giving them a moment to rest and readjust. He imagined his coat slung over the chair in the bar and grill. His wings were probably getting cold by now. The beer he hadn't touched was probably getting warm. He groaned. That had been his one request for the day. Cold beer, warm wings. As he blinked his eyes open again, something felt off and out of place. An alien sensation arose and skirted the outer rim of his consciousness, concocting something close to anticipation over some undesirable outcome. Then the question surfaced through the ocean of discomfort. Where am I? Where am I? Ronnie struggled to his feet. The grill he'd left to take his phone call was nowhere to be found. The window that had housed the flashy neon Bud Light sign was dark, and instead of the standard bar front windows he'd grown accustomed to, the window space was dark and appeared to be some kind of mosaic made from stained glass. A burst of anger sliced through Ronnie's mind. None of this made sense. Where the hell was he? He spun and limped in a full circle. Nothing was the same as it had been. He tried to recall when the shift had occurred, when the jubilant voices in the bar behind him had twisted into dead silence. When had the lights in the windows faded into dark reflective surfaces, absent of any warmth? The two buildings at either side of the grill were completely different in stature and style than Ronnie had remembered them. What had once been office spaces with slender studio apartments relaxing above them were now towering stone buildings with wooden highlights and sculpted window frames. They looked nothing like the coveted apartment spaces. Not one bit. Ronnie had known them well. He looked into renting one when he'd first moved to the city. It's how he'd found the tavern next door, which had quickly become his favorite go-to spot. The apartment hadn't worked out. The demand and price had been high. They had a timeless feature to them. Each seemed to hold elements of eras that made no sense, blending into one another as well as they did. He couldn't look away, and his intrigue only grew as his eyes started to focus more clearly. The throbbing in his temples dissipated. He rotated his achy wrists, hoping for the same result. Ronnie took a few steps forward. Then his feet continued to shuffle along the side of the building as if on their own accord. His eyes wandered over the various details presenting themselves through the dark. The streetlights shone different than he remembered them. They sparkled and danced, as if full of actual flames. He sat down on his heels, slumping slightly while he rubbed his wrists gently over his chest to ease the discomfort. His eyes traced over the dark shadows of vines crawling their way to the top of the buildings. It almost appeared they were moving in the shifting light. The feeling of the entire lane was foreign. The light was more orange and gold than blue and fluorescent, and came with a deep thread of nostalgia. Ronnie looked down at his cell phone screen. It was cracked and appeared to be dead. The screen shone black from his hand. Crap, I must have smashed it on the concrete. For the first time since he hit the wall, Ronnie looked closer at the surface he was seated on. It wasn't concrete at all. The street was made of cobblestone. This was strange. Suddenly, in his memory, items began to shift. It was as if the unknown and out of place was morphing to become familiar and useful, normal even. The idea of a device to call anyone in the world from felt foreign and strange. He slid the cell phone into his pocket as if in a daze. No, Ronnie challenged. No, this isn't right, he repeated defiantly. This is not where I was. I was at the grill. This is not where I was. Ronnie looked around himself again, but now, where he had been, felt unreachable and far away. The memory of his conversation with Paul fell into the shadows. Life felt hazy.
Hello, Tapperty.
The deep, multi-level voice rumbled in all around Ronnie. It was as if the words had echoed from inside his own head. Whatever had spoken to him had known his last name. Ronnie shot up and limped in a half circle until a prominent figure holding a torch caught his attention. It was positioned under an archway at the other end of the alley. The archway contained strange symbols that reflected in the torchlight. Ronnie squinted through the blaze. His eyes came to rest on the shadow extending out behind the flicker. It was strange. The creature stood on two legs. Massive green shaded objects extended out toward Ronnie. He assumed the structures were the creature's feet. 3 gourd-like extensions protruded from the objects. The more Ronnie focused on them, the more he was convinced these were this creature's feet and toes. Again, a piece of him drew back at the sight of something so monstrous, so otherworldly, while another felt less surprised with each passing moment. It was surrealism in the flesh. "How do you know my last name?" Ronnie called across the open space between them.
Lucky guess.
It rumbled. I find that highly unlikely. A low hiss sliced through the cold night air.
I guess I could smell it on you.
You could smell my family name on me.
That's what I said.
The option seemed about as likely as it being a lucky guess, or a coincidence that this creature had known something so personal. Okay, you know my name, but I don't know yours. So what's your name?
No, I don't know your name. I just know what your blood currently goes by.
Ronnie's confusion grew. His head was still swimming through everything. Well, my question still stands. I asked you your name. Ronnie pushed his question out with as much authority as he could muster without his knees shaking.
I'll give you 3 guesses.
The deep voice purred. It sounded like boulders scraping over a rocky surface. Ronnie resisted the urge to cringe at the echoes coursing off the walls surrounding him. Something in the confident challenge, rumbling from the massive shadowed stranger, sent a shiver down Ronnie's spine. And what if I say no?
Then you lose.
How can I lose if I don't agree to play in the first place?
Because it will disappoint me, and that isn't polite. Which means you lose twice. And I must warn you, I turn into a bit of a glutton when I'm unhappy.
Okay, that makes literally no sense.
My house, my rules.
The looming figure took a step closer to the light from the street lamps. Okay, well, by your rules standards, you would be the one being rude by demanding I play a game with no incentives for myself. That's bullying. And you are being a bully, which means you make me disappointed, so yeah, work that one out. The massive frame shook, causing the tiny rocks around Ronnie's feet to shake, rattle, and roll in all directions. After watching them dance for a moment, Ronnie looked back up at the looming figure. It seemed like it was humored by what he was saying, though it didn't say anything to reveal its thoughts one way or another. Okay, so what happens if I lose? Ronnie asked, more curious than ever.
Well, if you lose, I get to eat you.
Wow, okay, that is excessive. Ronnie sounded unsettled. He took a step backward before stammering. So what if I agree and I can't guess your name anyway? His voice quivering ever so slightly. The giant stepped further from the shadows, revealing a gruesome grin. Its skin was not only a horrendous shade of green that clashed with everything around it, but it was riddled in scars and warts. Ronnie was almost convinced he was looking at a toad person. But at the same time, there was a hint of lizardness and possibly an ogre to it. With all the details pouring in at once, Ronnie felt his fingers beginning to twitch in anticipation. It was hard to say what exactly this crazy thing was outside of a foe. Maybe classification didn't matter at a certain point when life and death were the only 2 options extending forward. Ronnie blinked away the disbelief. Here was a creature standing right in front of him that he would have deemed fictional less than an hour ago, and yet here it was, making promises of turning him into a late-night snack. All because he'd wanted a damn burger and some wings, and decided he had to be a good friend first. The creature spoke up again.
Well then, I guess that's another way for you to lose then.
Well, that hardly seems fair, Ronnie complained. You have 2 ways of winning, and I only have 1 way of winning, and I'm not even sure you'd let me live if I do win because I don't know you. The odds are kind of stacked against me from the start. The creature scratched its silhouetted head with its free hand.
Why should I care about what you find to be fair? It's my game.
The deep voice returned in a matter-of-fact tone.
I could just not let you play it at all and make a meal of you now instead.
Well, I don't think you should do that at all, Ronnie cried out, stepping backward again. No, you shouldn't. Don't you know anything about humans? If you're going to turn me into food, then it might be the prudent thing to get to know what you're about to eat. I could be poisonous for all you know.
Huh.
The creature snorted. Ronnie hurried forward while he still had its dwindling attention. If I disagree to be eaten, my meat won't be half as tender as it would be if I went willingly. If I'm upset, angry, or feel like you've slighted or cheated me in any way, my meat will become toxic to you immediately. It's our perfect defense against anything that might wish us harm. Ronnie did his best to be matter-of-fact as he looked down his nose and up at the figure just out of his eyes' ability to interpret properly. In my opinion, that would be really wasteful over an opportunity on your part. And sad, really. He blabbered on nervously, his uncertainty building as he started to realize that this wasn't a prank or a practical joke. He stepped backward carefully, taking cues from the confusion in the shadow's body language before moving forward. The giant stepped further into the light. As Ronnie moved backward, the giant stepped into the light, revealing a massive bubble head. Ronnie did his best to be polite, but he felt the grimace deeply. A shiver ran down his spine. 2 globular, watery eyeballs bulged above a wide, toad-like mouth, with thin lips and barely visible ears. The forehead was shiny and led into a hairless scalp. A halo of scraggly hair escaped around the creature's head. What on earth was this thing? And why did the term troll come to mind? At that moment, it was as if Ronnie's mind flip-flopped. The entire thing, this whole situation, was too strange to be weird. Even then, it felt almost natural that he would be sitting in this odd place that was completely separate from the scene he had just been in, speaking to this monstrous creature. I must be dreaming. The thought had occurred to him previously, but he'd shrugged it off. This time, it seemed the most likely option that had presented itself yet. Ronnie's headache from the impact with the wall had all but disappeared, as if it had perfectly dissolved into the shock of everything else. Ronnie took a few steps backward to even the distance between them, just in case. No, you know what? He threw up his hands in exasperation. You know what's rude, Mr. Troll? I am in a strange place, a complete stranger here. I don't even know exactly what it is that would be eating me. I think what's rude is that you wouldn't properly introduce and inform me over what I don't know before you eat me. The toady snarl offered in return might have been a smile, but Ronnie couldn't be sure. He smiled nervously back, just in case. The creature seemed to be big on niceties, rudeness, and riddles. Maybe feeding into any one of those 3 would be Ron's way of surviving this, dream or not.
Are you already decided on losing then, little man grub?
The creature boomed. Grub? For someone who cares so much over rudeness, you are completely rude. The creature laughed. The ground shook in the vibration of it. The brick wall rattled against something resting on the window ledge. The brick wall rattled against something resting on the window ledge. A flower pot, maybe?
Well, fine then. What would you have me call you instead?
Ronnie shook his head. A name for a name. He held up his hand, suddenly grateful for the years he'd been obsessed with Dungeons and Dragons and fairy tales and folklore, basically mythology of any kind. And they'd said it would never come in handy. His father's face came to mind, complete with the disapproving side gaze he'd really practiced into perfection. Ronnie pushed his hand forward to emphasize he was still waiting. The creature's snarl twisted and widened. It took another step forward and plopped hard onto the ground. Ronnie threw his hands out to stabilize from the impact that shook the ground around him more violently than he'd imagined it might. Whoa!
Okay, I have my rules. It would only be fair that you might have a few of your own, and I could let my appetite build, if that's what it takes.
The creature reasoned while crossing its massive legs.
Whatever I have to do to keep you tender.
Its stumpy teeth clenched and unclenched, as if it were already picturing eating him. The drool that dribbled from one side of its mouth all but confirmed Ronnie's gut feeling. Stop that! Ronnie's nose crinkled into a frown. He took a deep breath and sat down on his side of the open space with a grunt. The cobblestone was cold to the touch, refreshing under his now sweating palms. On a plus side, his wrists didn't hurt from the fall anymore. Not that he could feel anyway, but that could change once the shock wore off.
Well, what are they then?
The creature demanded impatiently.
What rules do you bring to the table?
Hold on. How long did you take to come up with your rules? Ronnie accused. I have a feeling I'm not the first poor creature you've come across with your stupid game, he added, rolling his eyes. The creature pointed around them.
You wouldn't be wrong.
His face split wide open again. His slitted eyes grew smaller.
When I first moved to this place, it was teeming with living things. And alas, I'm the only one left.
An expression dangerously close to self-satisfaction crossed over the creature's countenance.